She heard it through a door left open the width of a hand, which was one hand's width more than anyone in that house ever left anything. I do not marry the girl. I marry the 30th of September, and she is merely how I mean to reach it. Verity Colston stood very still in the passage, with a stack of borrowed candles going soft against her arms, and did not let the wax tip. Though her hands had gone strange and cold around them, she would remember that sentence longer than she remembered her own name spoken beside his an hour later, before witnesses, over wine, and she did not know yet what it would cost either of them, nor how long she would carry it folded small against her ribs, nor that he would spend the better part of a year trying to unsay it without ever once using words. She smoothed her sleeve, squared the candles as though they were a column of figures that had gotten out of order, and went in to be married to a date. The dining room at Rossmere was too grand for 6 people and a cousin, and the cousin was smiling before anyone had said anything worth smiling at. Mr. Edmund Vane had a way of arranging his face early, the way other men arranged their cutlery, and by the time Verity took her seat, he had already settled his expression into the particular gentleness he wore when he meant harm. Julian Vane, Duke of Rossmere, did not smile at all. He stood at the head of the table with a glass in his hand, and his brother's signet turning once, twice, around his smallest finger, and when he spoke his voice was quiet, in the way that only a man who has never had to raise it can afford to be quiet. To duty, he said, and nothing else, and drank, and the word landed in the room like a document being signed, rather than a wish being made. Verity lifted her own glass and drank to it too, because duty was, after all, a debt, and she had always paid her debts promptly and asked no one to feel tender about the arithmetic. She was 26, poor and precise, the kind of woman a room forgot to look at twice, which she had long ago stopped minding and started using. Her father, Mr. Hugh Colston, had died the previous winter owing more than the farm could answer for, and the mortgage on Colston land sat, inconveniently, on the Rossmere estate's own books, which was how a duke and a dead man's daughter had come to be discussing marriage at all. It was Mr. Blackwell, the family's solicitor, dry as a biscuit left out overnight, who explained the shape of the trap to her before she signed anything, so that she should not later say she had not been told. The old duke's will required that Julian be married by his 30th birthday, Michaelmas next, some 10 weeks off, or forfeit the guardianship of his brother's orphaned boy and every unentailed acre of the estate to the nearest cousin willing to marry sooner. The nearest cousin was, inconveniently again, smiling at the foot of the table with a glass of his own raised half a beat behind everyone else's, as though duty were a toast he had been practicing the wording of for years. "I ask nothing of you but arithmetic," Julian said to her later, when the others had gone, his voice pitched for her alone. "You will keep my books. I will keep your name out of the debtors' columns. It is a fair exchange, and I have never yet met a woman who objected to a fair exchange. She had not objected. She had only thought, privately, that a fair exchange was not the same as a kind one, and that she had heard him say the truer sentence through a door not an hour before, and that a woman who wished to survive a great house learned early which sentence to keep and which to let go. "A column that will not balance is a lie asking to be found," she told him instead, because it was true, and because it cost her nothing to say it, and he looked at her then the way a man looks at a ledger he has just realized might be more interesting than he had planned for. The heat that summer pressed on the back of the neck like a hand that would not lift, and McElmo stood at the far end of 10 weeks like a debt already called, and neither of them said what they meant, and both of them drank to duty, and somewhere down the table Edmund Vane refilled his own glass and did not stop smiling. The negotiation proper happened the next morning, in the estate office, over ledgers rather than wine, which suited her better. Julian met her there with his coat still faintly of horse and cedar, his gloves plain where his rank should have run to lace, and laid the Colston mortgage papers on the desk between them like a man laying down cards he did not intend to bluff with. You will have the farm restored to your name outright, free of the debt, upon the marriage, he said. That is the whole of what I am buying, and the whole of what you are owed. She turned the papers a quarter turn, squared their corners with one finger before she answered, a habit her father had beaten into her at his own desk, and grief had never managed to beat back out. And what is it you imagine I am buying? She asked. 10 weeks, he said. A boy's home. My cousin's disappointment, which I confess I will enjoy rather more than a groom ought to admit to enjoying anything on his own wedding day. There is a thing I cannot yet lay before you, he added, more quietly turning the ring rather than her. When I am able, you shall have it entire. She did not ask what the thing was. She had learned, in a hard year of watching her father's affairs come apart in other men's hands, that the quickest way to be told nothing was to demand everything at once, and so she only nodded, and said she would hold him to the account. It was Mrs. Nettlebed, the housekeeper, who found her an hour later, still bent over the mortgage papers, and pronounced, without being asked, that his lordship had not laughed a real laugh since his brother died, and that if Miss Colston meant to marry a ledger, she might at least try to marry the man attached to it. I am marrying his arithmetic, Verity said. He said so himself. Mrs. Nettlebed sniffed in the manner of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted both their opinions of her. Arithmetic, she said, does not turn a ring on its finger 300 times a day thinking about a woman's handwriting. Verity's own history came out of her in pieces over that week, the way grief always does, compressed rather than confessed, a father too proud to write for help until help was no longer of use, a mother dead of a fever, when Verity was small enough that only the smell of lavender and the sound of a particular hymn still carried her back, an inheritance eaten by bad seasons, and a steward, some years past, who had a talent for figures that never quite added up in the estate's favor. She did not connect that old steward to the cousin now smiling his way through Rossmere's corridors. She had no reason to yet. Julian's first genuine laugh came 3 days into that week, over nothing at all, a comment of Mrs. Nettlebed's about the new Duchess's habit of correcting the wine steward's sums aloud at table, and it startled him so thoroughly that he put a hand briefly to his own mouth as though checking that the sound had indeed come from him. Verity marked it the way she marked a column closing clean for the first time in months, with a small, private satisfaction she did not let reach her face. Duty, she thought, might yet be made to pay better interest than she had first accounted for. Edmund Vane paid his first call on her alone on the 4th day, ostensibly to welcome her to the family, and brought with him a scent of clove and orange flower so sweet it sat behind the eyes. He complimented her gown, which was 3 years turned and twice mended at the cuff, and complimented it in a way that made certain she knew he had noticed the mending. The accounting must be very neat, mustn't it? He said, smoothing a handkerchief once along his palm, by Michaelmas. His Grace is particular about neatness where his own interests are concerned. Less so, I think, where the interests of others are involved. She said nothing, only watched him the way she watched a suspect column, waiting to see which figure he would linger on. He lingered, in the end, on a date, a small slip really, mentioning in passing that the Colston mortgage had stood at a certain sum as of Lady Day, a sum 40 pounds heavier than the figure she herself had copied out of her father's own hand not 4 months before his death. She filed the discrepancy away the way she filed everything, without comment, and turned the subject to the weather, which that week was doing a fine impression of Judgment Day. The household, meanwhile, had begun to react to the engagement in the manner households always do, which is to say badly and at volume behind closed doors. Callers arrived who had not called in years. A betting book appeared, briefly, in the kitchen on how long the arrangement would survive contact with an actual wedding, until Mrs. Nettlebed confiscated it with the air of a woman confiscating a loaded pistol. Lady Cordelia Fenn, who had been the family's long-presumed choice for the position now occupied by a mortgaged farmer's daughter, paid a call of her own, exquisitely cold, and looked at Verity the way one looks at a sum one has already decided must be wrong. "I hope you know what you have bought," Lady Cordelia said. "I know precisely what I have sold," Verity answered, which was truer than she liked, and Lady Cordelia's mouth did something complicated that was not quite a smile and not quite its opposite. That night, unable to sleep for the heat, Verity took a candle down to the estate office to compare her father's account book against the copy of the Rossmere rent roll Julian had left out for her review, and found, in the column recording Colston debts, an entry in ink noticeably fresher than its neighbors, in a hand that wanted very badly to be mistaken for an older one. She did not wake anyone. She only sat a long while in the dark, with the two books open side by side, the way a woman sits with a wound before deciding whether to name it, and let a single lark, confused by her candle into thinking morning had come early, sing itself hoarse outside the office window. She brought the discrepancy to Julian 2 nights later, not because she distrusted him, but because she trusted the ledger more than she trusted anyone, including herself. They worked past midnight at the long table, her father's book and the estate's rent roll spread between them like two witnesses, giving different testimony about the same crime, and somewhere in the second hour their hands ended up nearer the same page than either had quite planned. "This entry is not my father's hand," she said, holding the candle so the ink caught the light rather than her face. "He copied his 7s with a hook. Whoever wrote this one does not know he had a hook." Julian studied it a long moment, then closed the rent roll slowly, the way a man closes a coffin, gently and for good, though it would prove not to be for good at all. "I have suspected the accounts for some time," he said. "I have not yet been able to prove where the suspicion should land. There is a name I am not ready to say aloud, because if I am wrong, I will have accused a dead man's cousin of theft over a dead man's daughter's debt, and if I am right, I will have to explain to a 6-year-old boy why the only uncle he has left besides myself cannot be trusted with a coin." She did not press him, though the promise sat between them, half paid and aching to be finished. Instead, she asked after the boy, Freddie and Julian's face did something she had not yet seen it do, softened at the edges the way ground softens after long rain. And he told her, in pieces, about his brother Robert, dead not 2 years past under circumstances the family called an accident, and Julian, privately, called a slow bleeding out of debts he had never told anyone about until they told him. "I could not save him," Julian said. "I did not even know he needed saving until the saving was finished. It is why I read every column myself now. It is why I will not let another child in this house learn what an unread column can cost." She reached across the table then, not quite touching his hand, and said the thing she had been saving without meaning to save it. "Duty is a debt," she said. "I mean to pay mine and be done." It was, she told herself afterward, only ever meant as a plain statement of terms. It did not feel plain when she said it, and it did not feel plain on his face when he heard it, and the lark outside the window, confused again, sang once and stopped, as though it too had decided the hour required a different kind of silence than the one it knew how to keep. He laughed again that night, briefly, at something so small neither of them could later agree what it had been, and she counted it, as she had the first, the way she counted every entry that closed a column cleaner than it had opened. The storm broke on the 42nd night of the engagement, which was also, Verity would later think, the night the whole arrangement broke a little too, before it could be mended properly. Edmund Vane came to her in the small parlor while Julian was from home on estate business, and set before her a letter under a hand she did not recognize, addressed to Julian's solicitor, discussing in the coldest terms the Colston mortgage's value once absorbed fully into the estate, and a second paper beneath it, a note in Julian's own script, torn so that only half a sentence survived. Something about the marriage being concluded, and the annulment to follow once the guardianship was secured past challenge. "He thought you should know before the banns are called a third time," Edmund said, smoothing his handkerchief along his palm, his voice so gentle it was nearly a lullaby. "I have always thought a woman deserves the truth of her own purchase price." Verity read the torn line twice, 3 times, while thunder walked closer over the roof, and felt the peculiar vertigo of watching her own competence turned against her, for it was her own notes on the mortgage's worth, copied nearly verbatim into the first letter, notes she had given Julian in trust not a fortnight before. It was not fear that moved through her first. It was not even anger. Anger would have been easier. It was the flatter, colder thing beneath both, the sense of a column she had trusted finally, definitively failing to balance. She was still standing with the papers in her hand when Julian returned, rain-soaked, and found her there, and something in her face must have told him everything before either of them spoke, for his own face went the particular still of a man taking a blow without letting it report itself outward. "That is not the whole letter," he said. "It is half a letter, and half a letter is a lie shaped like the truth." "Then give me the other half," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, behind her back, had found each other and gone very tight. "I cannot, not yet," he began, and the rest of the sentence never arrived, because the door opened on Edmund Vane again, all soft apology, informing them that Mr. Blackwell had arrived unannounced on some pressing matter of the audit, and the moment closed over itself like water over a dropped coin. And Verity went up to her room that night with the torn line still held, unwillingly, against her ribs, and did not sleep, and somewhere below the house the storm finished what the summer's heat had only threatened to begin. Edmund found her alone again 2 mornings later, in the garden, where she had gone specifically to be found by no one, and offered her, with the same gentle voice he used for threats, a way out that cost her nothing but her pride. "A settlement," he said, generous and quietly paid, and a story put about that the match had been mutually and amicably ended. Her father's name left entirely untouched by any talk of debt or fraud, if she would simply withdraw before the bans were read a 3rd time. "No one need ever know what the letters said," he told her. "No one need ever know you were bought and meant to be discarded. You need only go quietly, and I will see you go comfortably." It was, she understood even as he said it, the kindest cruelty she had yet been offered, precisely tailored to the one thing she had left to protect, her father's memory. And she stood a long moment turning the offer over the way she turned a column that would not close, looking for the entry that made it honest, and found none. "I have never yet lost by expecting the worst of a ledger," she said at last, "or the best of no one but myself. I will not be bought twice in 1 year, Mr. Vane, once by a dying man's debt, and once by his cousin's mercy." She walked back into the house with her spine very straight, and her reputation, she knew, now entirely at the mercy of whatever story Edmund chose to tell in her place. And it cost her, that refusal, more than she let her face admit, for within the week the whispers had already begun that the Duke's intended had been offered money to go, and had somehow, scandalously, refused it, which was its own kind of ruin dressed as virtue. Julian found her that evening in the estate office, both books still open where she had left them, and said, without preamble, that he meant to send her to her aunt's house in the next county until Michaelmas, for her own protection, so that whatever came next between himself and his cousin need not come down upon her also. She heard, beneath the plain kindness of the sentence, only its shape, which was the same shape as the sentence she had overheard on the very first night, a woman being managed rather than consulted, arithmetic rather than a person, and she went, because refusing him twice in 1 week was more defiance than even she could afford, and because some small, tired part of her had begun to believe the torn letter after all. The darkest of it came 3 weeks later, in her aunt's narrow parlor, with the Michaelmas deadline now less than a fortnight off, and no word from Rossmere in 9 days. She had begun, in that silence, to compose the sentence she would use to end the engagement herself, cleanly, before he could do it in a manner that cost her father's name anything further, when Mrs. Nettlebed arrived unannounced and travel-stained, having ridden the distance herself rather than trust a letter to the post. "His Grace does not know I have come," the housekeeper said, wringing her hands only once before flattening them deliberately against her apron, the way a woman flattens a decision she has already made. "He has near ruined himself proving what that man did to your father's books, and he means to do the last of it alone tomorrow night, before Mr. Blackwell and the whole household, and he has told no one, least of all you, because he has some fool notion that if it goes wrong he would rather it fall on him only. He is going to walk into that room with half a case and a cousin who has had 10 weeks to sharpen his own version of events." Verity sat very still, the way she had sat still the first night in the passage with the candles, and asked what proof he lacked. "Yours," said Mrs. Nettlebed, "your father's book. The true one, in his own hand, that only you have ever thought to keep." She did not sleep that night either, but for a different reason than before, and by first light she had packed the account book, wrapped it in oiled cloth against the weather, and was on the road back to Rossmere before her aunt had finished remarking on the impropriety of it, leaving behind her only the blackest of the season's questions. Unanswered still, whether a man who would rather be ruined alone than protected in company had ever truly meant to let her stand beside him at all, or whether some habits of grief run too deep even for love to argue with. She reached Rossmere the evening before the audit and found the house already gathering itself for a different kind of tribunal than any dinner party. Mr. Blackwell had arrived with his boxes of papers and his expression of a man who has seen every family's worst arithmetic and stopped being surprised by any of it. Lady Cordelia had come too, uninvited by anyone but curiosity, and took a chair at the room's edge with the stillness of a woman who suspects she is about to be proven wrong about something and has decided to watch it happen properly rather than miss it. Verity found Mrs. Nettlebed first, and it was the housekeeper, flattening her apron again, who produced the second piece of the proof. A letter, taken from the returning postboy's bag 3 weeks earlier and never sent onward, in which Edmund Vane instructed a hired clerk, one Mr. Sims, in the precise entries required to make the Colston debt appear £40 heavier than it had ever truly been, and to make the ink of those entries pass, under a quick glance, for 4 years old rather than 4 months. It was the one decisive, quiet piece of courage the housekeeper would ever need to perform in her life, and she performed it without once raising her voice about it. Verity found Julian last, in the estate office, turning the ring on his smallest finger so fast it had gone raw at the joint, and set both books down before him, her father's and the estate's, side by side. "I have the other half of your letter," she said. "Not the one Edmund tore, the one that was never sent at all." He looked at her a long moment, and something in his face cracked open the way composure cracks only under the weight of relief rather than grief, and he said only, "You came back," as though it were the whole of an argument rather than 3 words. "I did not come back for you," she said, not entirely truthfully. "I came back for the book." He almost laughed, the sound catching before it could finish itself, and for the first time since the storm she let herself believe that whatever tomorrow's reckoning cost them both, it would at least be paid honestly, before witnesses, in the light, where a lie could no longer pass for a debt long enough to collect on it. Somewhere past the window, a lark that had lost the habit of silence sang once into the dark, entirely out of season, as though it too had decided the waiting was finished. The audit convened the following afternoon in the long room where the betrothal dinner had been held 10 weeks before, the same table, the same chairs, Mr. Blackwell now seated at its head instead of Julian, his boxes of figures squared before him like a magistrate's bench. Edmund Vane arrived composed, scented faintly of clove, his handkerchief already moving once along his palm before anyone had said a word against him, though his eyes went, just once, to the oiled cloth parcel under Verity's arm, and something in his face lost, for the length of a single breath, its careful arrangement. Mr. Blackwell began plainly, reading the estate's rent roll aloud, the recorded sum of the Colston debt. And Verity rose when he reached it and asked leave to lay a second book beside the first. She held both to the light of the window, her father's true hand against the estate's copied one, the hook of his 7s absent from every disputed entry, the ink of those entries catching the light with a wet, recent sheen no 4-year-old figure could have kept. "A column that will not balance," she said, "is a lie asking to be found, and I have found it." Mr. Sims, the hired clerk, summoned to confirm the entries were his own copying and no one else's, began the answer he had clearly rehearsed, that he had merely transcribed figures given him in good faith, until Mr. Blackwell asked him one question only, quietly, without heat, and in whose hand, Mr. Sims, "were those figures given you? For I have here the letter that gave them." The clerk's composure did not survive the question. He named Edmund Vane before he had finished drawing the breath to deny it, and the room went the particular kind of silent that follows a held breath being let out all at once. Edmund did not shout, did not deny it further, only sat very still, his handkerchief stopped mid-motion in his palm, and when he finally spoke it, it was not to defend himself, but to explain, in a voice gone suddenly unguarded, that he had watched his cousin Robert ruin himself and die of it while everyone called it an accident, had watched Julian inherit grief and a dukedom both, had watched himself remain, always, the spare figure in someone else's column, and had told himself, for years, that the arithmetic of the world owed him a correction it would never volunteer on its own. It was not greed, at the last, that moved in his face, but something nearer grief, badly worn, and the room's anger softened toward him by exactly the width Julian allowed it to, when he spoke at last and said there would be no magistrate, no public ruin to fall upon a name young Freddie would one day have to carry into the world himself, an allowance, modest and quiet, and passage arranged within the fortnight to a cousin's holding overseas, mercy extended not for Edmund's sake, but because a boy of 6 should not inherit his family's worst chapter along with its name. It was 3 days later the Colston debt struck clean from every book that had ever carried it falsely, Michaelmas itself only a sunrise off, that Julian found her again in the estate office, the 2 account books closed now and resting together on the desk as though they had finally agreed on a single truth between them. "I no longer need to marry a date," he said. "The guardianship is secured, The land is yours outright, regardless of what either of us decides tomorrow. And I find, now that the debt is fully paid, that I do not wish to be released from it at all. I ask nothing of you but arithmetic. He had told her once, I find, he said now, turning her own book gently under his hand rather than his ring, that I want considerably more from you than arithmetic, and I would have you know that whatever you answer, the boy's home and your father's land are safe regardless, so that nothing you say to me now need be a payment of any kind. Marry me, he said, because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take. Duty is a debt, she said back to him, and I have paid mine, entire, and finds herself, unaccountably, wishing to keep something further besides. The wedding, when it came the following week, was smaller than the betrothal dinner had been loud, a handful of witnesses in the village church with the first cold light of true autumn coming level through the windows. Mrs. Nettlebed weeping without shame through the whole of it and loudly informing anyone near her that she had said, from the very first week, that no man turned a ring 300 times a day over mere arithmetic. Lady Cordelia stood witness too, dignified in her own defeat, and would go on, within the year, to make a match of her own choosing rather than her family's, which she would later call the only sum she had ever been glad to see corrected. Mr. Blackwell retired not long after to a cottage full of ledgers he kept now for pleasure rather than duty. Mr. Sims took a position in a distant county where no one had heard the name Vane spoken with anything but ordinary courtesy. Edmund Vane wrote once a year, briefly, from abroad, letters that grew, slowly, less bitter than the man who had written the first of them. Freddie grew a full inch and learned to read a column properly, under an aunt who insisted a boy ought to know exactly what he owned and what he owed before anyone tried to tell him otherwise. It was a year on, nearly to the week, that the household gathered again in that same long room, the same table, the harvest light coming low and gold through the same windows that had once let in a pressing, punishing summer heat, and Julian rose with a glass in his hand exactly as he had risen once before. To duty, he said, half in earnest, half in the old habit of a joke only the two of them still understood, his brother's ring catching the candlelight as he turned it, slower now, without the old raw urgency beneath it. Verity lifted her own glass, met his eyes across a table that no longer felt like a ledger awaiting a signature, and did not drink. To freedom, she said instead, and set her glass down, gently, beside her plate, unfinished, the way a woman sets down a debt she has decided, at last, she owes to no one. If this story warmed you, if some part of you has ever been the overlooked column in somebody else's careless sum, and longed only to be read properly at last, then come sit by this fire a while longer with me, for there is a chair kept and a kettle on, and no one here who will call your patience a debt. Tell me in the comments below which line you would have answered back at that table, duty or freedom, and whether you have ever set a glass down yourself rather than drink to a toast that no longer fit you. Stay by the hearth, subscribe if you'd like a place kept warm here for the next one, and go gently now, out into your own ledger of days, and be kind to the ones who are still learning to read you properly. Sleep well, and keep your accounts honest, and your heart, when at last it balances, entirely your own.